Hello and a very good day. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Abhilash and I am from the AD Solutions team here at Manage Engine, and I would be your presenter slash speaker for today. Now, before we go ahead and jump in, I would like to thank all of you for joining in. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your patience. Now, I understand that this is the middle of the week, and considering the pandemic and everything, most of us are working from home. And I would like to thank you all again for taking out the time for joining in. And I hope all of you are indoors and healthy and safe. Now, before we go ahead and jump in and see what's in store for us, I would like to run a quick audio and video check because I want to make sure that everybody out here today are able to hear me well and are able to see the video or the screen well, right? So I'm quickly going to start off with an audio check. So if my voice is well and audible, if you can hear my voice, if you can hear the audio without any distortion or without any trouble, can you please use the Q&A tab or can you use the chat box and give me a confirmation, please? Just say yes, just say okay, just say great, so I can confirm that my voice is reaching to you well and clear. Thank you, Arun. Thank you, Ashfaq. Thank you, Jurika. Thank you so much for your responses. Perfect. Thank you, Dinusha. Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Praneeth. Thank you, Sanjeet. Perfect. I hope you can see the title and my email ID as well. If you can, if you could just give me one more confirmation for the video, we should be good to go. Brilliant. Looks like everything is okay. Thank you so much, Ramzi. Thank you for your confirmation. All right, perfect. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. And before I begin, I would like to tell you that the entire session that's happening today is going to be recorded, and the recording will be sent to you on your email post the webinar. All right. And if you've got any questions during the course of the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A tab and let me know. I will do my best to answer your questions during the course of the webinar. And even if I miss answering your questions, please do not worry. The last 10 to 15 minutes will be a dedicated Q&A session. So I will be taking in all your questions and I will be answering all your questions then as well. And last but not the least, if you've got any questions later during the day post today's webinar, you can just drop an email to me anytime at abi@manageengine.com. That's abi@manageengine.com. And I'd be more than happy to help you out any way I can. All right. So yes, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. The topic for today is mastering Active Directory and Azure Active Directory administration. Right. Now, the whole reason I chose to speak about this topic today, the whole reason I wanted this topic to be the agenda for today's webinar is to shed light on an important fact, right? And the fact here is the shift in the IT landscape. Right now, it's no secret that Active Directory has been along from a very, very long time. Organizations such as yours have been using Active Directory as a prime mode for authentication and authorization to resources that are located on premises. But now, as of 2019 and 2020, organizations, businesses, both small, medium, and large, are gradually adopting public cloud services. Public cloud services like Microsoft Azure Active Directory or Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud for that matter, right? And this adoption of public cloud infrastructures alongside traditional on-premises infrastructures, together we call them hybrid AD infrastructures or hybrid IT infrastructures. And this sudden adoption has called for a change in the administration strategies that we have, right? Because earlier users just had a single account. All they had to do was log on to the domain, access the resources that are located on premises, access data stored in file servers on premises, and probably access applications that are hosted also on on-premises servers, right? But now with the introduction of Azure Active Directory, end users in an organization have more than a single identity. That's right, it's no longer just a single domain joined account. Users may have identities in Active Directory, in Azure Active Directory, in applications supported by Azure Active Directory like Office 365, Salesforce, or Dropbox. The list simply goes on, right? And with the increase of bring your own device or BYOD concepts, and with the inclusion of cloud services like Azure Active Directory, users can now access company sensitive data from any device in their organization. right? They're not just restricted to their domain joined systems alone. Now, because of the introduction of public cloud services like Azure Active Directory alongside our traditional on-premises infrastructures, we have to make some changes. We have to redesign our existing administration strategy. We have to redesign our existing security strategy to suit hybrid Active Directory, a combination of Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, right? So let's take a look at the agenda today and see what's in store for us. We will take a look at the hybrid AD landscape. Now, like I said, organizations are adopting Azure Active Directory alongside traditional on-premises infrastructures. Let's take a look at the benefits it brings in, and let's also take a look at the challenges that come in with the hybrid AD landscape, right? So that's going to be the second part of today's webinar. We'll take a look at the challenges that administrators such as yourself, IT decision makers, security analysts, or even help desk technicians face when it comes to administering Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, all right? And last but not the least, we will employ a simple three-step strategy to improve Active Directory and Azure Active Directory administration. And not to worry, we will also take a look at the native solutions of Active Directory, of Azure Active Directory. We'll learn how they fail, how they have drawbacks when it comes to administration, and we'll see how Manage Engine AD 360 can help you with that. All right, so without further ado, let's jump in. Now, like I said, public cloud services are slowly evolving. If you can see from the picture above, on-premises Active Directory is connected with Azure Active Directory, typically via an Azure AD Connect server. Right? And as you can see, AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud are the top adopted public cloud services alongside traditional on-premises Active Directory infrastructure. This is a report generated as of 2020. Right? And although Azure is in the second most position, Azure is quickly catching up to be the most widely adopted public cloud service. Now, organizations may choose to adopt public cloud infrastructures for various reasons. The most basic reason that springs to mind is saving money when it comes to infrastructure, right? Because employees have growing needs, employees need access to various applications, various services to perform their job roles, and hosting everything on on-premises hardware or on-premises infrastructure is not cost efficient. And this is making companies adopt public cloud services like Azure Active Directory, right? And cloud service, the most basic advantage of a public cloud service is anytime, anywhere accessibility. And the reason most companies choose Azure Active Directory when compared to AWS or Google Cloud or any other cloud service is because Azure Active Directory has seamless integration with on-premises Windows Server Active Directory, right? And Azure Active Directory out of the box supports many popular SaaS applications like Office 365 or Dropbox or Slack or HackerRank. The list simply goes on. Right? So yes, companies are adopting public cloud services, and companies are gradually willing to move their data from traditional on-premises infrastructure to the cloud. Right? Earlier, when cloud was first introduced, everybody had the fear, everybody had the doubt as to what will happen to their personal data or their corporate data when moved to the cloud. They were worried about compliance, they were worried about security, but now companies are slowly starting to trust public cloud services, and they are willing to move corporate sensitive data and financial data to the public cloud like Azure Active Directory. Right? And it's predicted that by the end of 2021, at least 50% of company workload will be moved to the cloud. Now, this may or may not be true when it comes to your business or your organization, but it would be safe to say that within the next few months, you would be willing to move at least some of your organization sensitive data, your corporate data, your financial data, or your personally identified information, your PII information, to public cloud infrastructures like Azure Active Directory, right? But it's great that companies are adopting public cloud services. It's great that organizations are willing, are happy, are have no more fear to move their personal data, to move their corporate data to the cloud, but that does not mean that cloud is secure, right? So although public cloud infrastructures are being adopted, although public cloud infrastructures are increasingly being adopted in 2019 and in 2020, both by the large enterprises and the medium businesses alike, the problems still exist. security, managing resources such as licenses, and ensuring that the right user has access to the right resources. Or identity governance are three major problems when it comes to adopting public cloud services. These are the three major challenges that most organizations face, right? And security is at the top of the list. So what are the challenges that admins, help desk, or security analysts face when it comes to a hybrid AD infrastructure or an infrastructure that has Active Directory and Azure Active Directory? The first challenge that most administrators face is the lack of visibility, right? Now it's very difficult for us to obtain the state of permissions on Active Directory alone. Simply to understand which user has access to which server, which user has access to what data, what are the attribute values for a user, how long has it been since the user's password has been changed, what are the group memberships of a particular user, right? Information such as this was difficult to obtain using Active Directory, but now with the introduction of Azure, the problem has only expanded, right? Another problem that comes in when it comes to Active Directory and Azure Active Directory administration is the lack of centralization. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, if I simply head on to my domain controller, and if I open up my Active Directory users in Computers console, you can see that this is where I manage my Active Directory objects. This is where I create my computers, and this is where I manage my group policies for my Active Directory users and my security principles like computers, etc. But none of these tools can be used to manage Azure Active Directory. Similarly, if I head into Azure Active Directory, we've got the Azure AD portal using which we can manage resources, users, groups, devices within Azure Active Directory. But none of these tools, none of these options can be used to manage on-premises AD users. That's the first problem when it comes to hybrid AD infrastructures, and that is components operate in silos, meaning the tools, the options to manage Azure Active Directory cannot be used to manage Active Directory and vice versa, right? So administering a hybrid infrastructure as a whole from a single roof, under a single roof, from a single screen is very difficult because you have to toggle between windows, you have to toggle between screens, you have to toggle between applications and portals to manage Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, right? Last but not the least is security. Whenever there is a sensitive change happening in Azure Active Directory, such as a user's password has been reset, right? Whenever there is a sensitive security change happening in Active Directory, such as a logon failure on a domain controller, sensitive security changes like this have to be brought to notice, and that's where the tools do not help you again, because both tools do not work in cohesion with each other. What do I mean by that? If I head on to my browser, if I head on to my VM, you can see my event viewer. The security tab of the event viewer basically records changes that are happening in Active Directory. File or folder changes, group membership changes, user attribute changes, computer changes, right? And for Azure Active Directory, we've got something called the Audit Logs. And you basically have to go through the logs here, go through the logs within Active Directory, bring them under a single roof to see what's happening, to capture sensitive events and detect on them. All right, so without wasting further time, let's take a look at 3 steps that you can use right away to better administer your Active Directory and your Azure Active Directory infrastructure. Right? The first step that I would like for you to pick up is to understand which users have permission to what resources or gain visibility, right? Because only after you gain visibility will you be able to fix any vulnerabilities, fix any misconfigured permissions. And after you fix the permissions, the third step will be to enforce security, to keep these permissions from changing, or to ensure authorized changes of access or permissions. So the first step is to gain visibility, but where would we start? We've got Azure, we've got Active Directory, we've got on-premises file servers, we've got applications within Azure Active Directory like Microsoft Teams or Office 365. Where would we start, right? So for starters, we can break this down into 2 parts. One is on-premise Active Directory, and the other is Azure Active Directory. And when it comes to on-premise Active Directory, I would like for you to start off with monitoring these things that you see on your screen right now. First thing that I would like for you to monitor is your object attribute values, because each attribute value of an object can give your user access and can put your AD infrastructure at risk. Right? So each object attribute value, be it for a user, a computer, a group, an OU, have to be monitored. And that's something that I would like for you to start off with. Then I would like for you to look into permissions on your security objects, ACLs on your security objects. And last but not the least, I would like for you to look into your file server permissions, right? So why is monitoring object attribute values so important? Let me show you a simple example right here. All right. So if I head on to my VM and if I open up my ADUC console, this is what we use to manage, to administer Active Directory, right? This is what most of us use. And let's say I want to find out which of my users have the password never expires flag set. Now, how would I do that? I'll have to right click on the user, head into properties, and I have to head into the account tab. And over here, I have to see if this particular box is checked or not. Let's say I want to find out which servers a particular user can log on to. I'll have to check the log on to tab, right? Let's say I want to find out the remote control permissions on this particular user account, namely which user can remotely interact with Abhi's session, right? Let's say I want to find out the group memberships of a user. I have to do that using the member of tab, right? So every attribute value can give access to your Active Directory infrastructure, thereby monitoring every single attribute value for your users, for your OUs, for your groups, and for your computers is absolutely important and is the need of the hour, right? The other thing I spoke about was explicit permissions. Now, explicit permissions in simple words are these, right? So let's say I have my marketing OU right here. I right click on it, I hit on properties, and in the security tab, this is where a user can be explicitly given permissions on the marketing OU that you can see right here, right? Another way a user can be given permissions is by delegating control over a particular object within Active Directory. It could be a group, it could be an OU, the list simply goes on, right? So using this option, you can delegate permissions over all the OUs inside your Active Directory infrastructure. So these are explicit permissions when granted to your users, and that's something you'll have to check as well, right? And how do I check these permissions? The only way I can do that is by right-clicking on an object, selecting properties, checking the security tab for each security object, and checking if an end user has permissions on this object that he or she is not supposed to have, right? How do I check attribute values for each and every object? I'll have to open up an object. Here we have Jesse, and I'll have to manually check the attribute value of each and every object, right? And what happens when it comes to file or folder permissions? The same process repeats again, where I'll have to right click on a file or folder, properties, and check the security tab, right? So using the GUI tools, the process can get monotonous, the process can get repetitive, especially when you're trying to discover permissions on bulk users. This can be a huge problem, right? Another way you can discover permissions is by using shells, your command line shell or your PowerShell, right? Now, the problem with this is you'll have to write long lines of code. And let's face it, as admins, we do not have the time to write so much code. And number two is that scripts, finding unique scripts to your organization specific requirements. Let's say you need to find out the attributes of a sales user in so-and-so OU. And let's say you have to check if a particular flag has been enabled for the user or not. If you have to do things like that, it's extremely difficult to do so using shells, because you'll have to create a script from scratch to perform such activities. And last but not the least, scripts may introduce changes that are malicious, right? Let me show you a simple example right here. If I head on to my VM, and you see the script right here called the power up script. Here's what I'm going to do, right? I'm going to blow up my PowerShell console. I'm going to shift to the desktop. All right. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and query all the security groups in my organization, right? So I'm just going to search for my global group. Here we go. Once I hit enter, I have all the group details right here. right? So these are all the security groups in my organization. For sure, I'll have my administrators group here. I'll have my other privileged groups here. And here's what I'm going to do, right? I'm going to clear this up, run a command, and I'm going to import the module, the PowerShell module that you just saw on your screen, right? So it's going to be import module powerup.ps1, right? So this is the module that I'm trying to import right here. And what is this module going to do? Let me show you what it does, right? So if I type in a command called write user add MSI, this module will push out an MSI application on the desktop, right? And what does the MSI application do? If I double click on it, let me just click. All right, let's take a second. Here we go, right? You see that Windows has tried to block the application execution for the first few times, but then I kept clicking on it. The application finally opened, and this is basically a GUI to add a backdoor user into any group that you wish within Active Directory, right? So I'm going to hit create, and you can see that once I hit create, the user will be added to the backdoor group. So let's say I add my user RB right here. So RB is the name of my user, and I hit create, the user will be added to the group, right? So here we go, RB1, I hit create. And if I open up my PowerShell console, and if I type in a command called net local group administrators, here we go. Here we have my user RB1 and RB both added to the group. And here's my user backdoor at 1234 as well. How could this attack happen? How could an end user simply run a script, install an application, and use the MSI application to add a backdoor user into Active Directory? Right? Now, this is where I say monitoring object attribute changes on objects is extremely important. Right? Now, let me show you how this attack happened. If I open this up, if I clear this, if I run a command called net user ROS, you'll notice that ROS is a member of these groups and these groups alone. So Active Directory tells me that ROS is not an administrator or a privileged user of any kind, just a standard domain user logging onto his domain join system. Right? Now let me show you something else. If I minimize this, open up my browser, head into AD Manager Plus, head into reports, and if I log back in, all right, so that's reports. And I've got something called user reports here, and I'm going to head into groups for users. And here's my user Ross. And as you can see, Ross is a member of Support Australia. That's something we knew already, right? And Support Australia is a member of Support Emergency, and Support Emergency is a member of domain admins. And Ross indirectly or via nested privileges has achieved the domain administrator privilege, right? This is something Active Directory will not tell you, right? So that's why it's really important for us to monitor each and every attribute value. If I head back into reports and if I head into users and groups, here's my group. And do you see this magic checkbox right here? This will help you toggle between nested group memberships and indirect group memberships. And once you find a nested group membership, all you got to do is simply check the user account. Let's say I don't want this user to be a member of the group. I can delete the user. I can remove the user from the group. I can disable the user. I can perform any action that I want, right? So the reports tab of AD Manager Plus right here will help you basically drill down and find out individual attribute values for all of your users that can help you administer better or that can help you improve security. For example, if I head into inactive users, right? These are all my user accounts that have been enabled, but they have been inactive for a long, long time. This user account RB3 has been inactive from 2019. So these are enabled, but haven't been logged onto in a long, long time. These are something that have to be cleaned up, and the tool will help you do it for you. You can delete, disable, and you can move the user to another OU. The list simply goes on, right? If I head into password reports, you've got something called password unchanged users that will help you determine your users' passwords and how long they have been unchanged for, right? You can find out recent logon failures on your domain. And do you remember the recent use case that I spoke about? If you have to find out which users have password never expires, this report will give you all. Right? If I head back into user reports, you will find something here called your users never logged on report. Now, this is a condition that happens in most organizations where user accounts are created but are seldom used. They have weak passwords, which makes them a target for attacks. This report will help you find out which user has never logged on. And of course, you can clean up those accounts as well. Right? If I head into security reports, this report will help you to find out every explicit permission on your security object. The only way you could do that in Active Directory is to, again, just to refresh your memory, manually check the security tab of each and every object to find out if an unauthorized user has permissions here. But the tool will help you automate that process for you. Right? You could hit on search permissions, you could select an object, you could select a user group or a computer, and once you hit generate, you can search for specific permissions on your objects. You could also specify the permissions right here if you wanted to. Right? One more thing that I wanted to talk about is your Ntfs reports. This will help you to find out permissions across your file servers, your Windows file servers, your Ntfs servers within Active Directory. Right? If I click on folders accessible by accounts, all you got to do is select an account right here. So I'm just going to search for my account Luna. And here we go. Here's my account. And I want to check for folders in my particular DC. And once I set the subfolder level for which I wish to search the permissions for, I can select the permission that I wish to search for. I'm going to say any control. And once I hit generate, the information is right in front of me. Right? So this reports tab that you see right here will help you drill down on individual Active Directory objects, each attribute belonging to an individual Active Directory objects. For example, you can find out all computers that are inactive in your organization, right? That are basically created, but haven't been logged onto in a long, long time. So you can find out various values based on your individual objects in Active Directory. And of course, each report has built-in management actions. So if you find something wrong, if you find something that should not be there, you can immediately fix it as well. Right? For example, if you have two users with duplicate email addresses, now this could be a problem, right? And you can simply select the attribute right here. You can find the user and you can fix the problem then and there. All right. So this will basically help you understand what permissions your users have on your domain. The first step, like I said, is to drill down into individual attributes, something you can do. Drill down into security object permissions, something you can do. Drill down into file or folder permissions, right? And when it comes to Azure Active Directory, we've got a separate tool for that called Office 365 Manager Plus that will help you to drill down individual reports based on Azure Active Directory, right? So there are many, many things you can check. For example, users whose passwords have been unchanged for a long time in Azure Active Directory, right? Users who have been locked out in Azure Active Directory, logon failures that have occurred in Azure Active Directory, your Azure Active Directory devices and who are their owners and who are the users. You can find out Azure Active Directory group reports, as you can see right here. You can also find out license reports. Basically, you can understand which user has what license, so you can better allocate your licenses. This is another feature of AD 360 where you can basically find out what licenses your end users have and ensure judicial usage of licenses. And not just licenses, you can also monitor storage across Azure AD applications such as OneDrive, Skype, etc. Right? If I head into other Azure reports right here, you'll find something called recently added members from roles, recently removed members from roles. That will help you basically understand which user has access to what role within Azure Active Directory. We've also got something called security reports that will basically help you to understand what are the admin roles in Exchange, what are the admin roles in Azure Active Directory or Office 365, right? What are your mailbox permissions? Which user has been delegated permissions on mailboxes? And also you can find out reports such as your mailbox folder permissions as well, right? Here we go. So again, there are a lot of reports that we have to go through here, but we do not have the time for it. So I'd just like to say that every object within your Azure Active Directory, users, groups, licenses, and applications that are supported in Azure Active Directory And also if you use Exchange Online, reports regarding to mailboxes are all available. All you got to do is click, view the report that you want, and you have the information right in front of you without having to manually head into the tool and then open up a user account and then see what value that particular user has. Right? This will save you tremendous amounts of time. And of course, there's no scripting involved. The tool will do it for you. All right. So that's the first thing that I would like for you to do. The first thing that I would like for you to do is to basically look at your object attribute values, look at your permissions across ACLs on objects, across data storage devices, and look at Azure Active Directory permissions as well. Right? There are a lot of reports that you can leverage to understand or discover the attribute values or the permissions your users have with an Active Directory and with an Azure Active Directory. Here are a few examples that you could leverage right away. The second step, the second and the most important step that I wanted to talk about is centralized administration. Now that we've understood our users, what kind of permissions they have on what object, we were able to read through individual object values, individual attribute values. We took a look at permissions on files and folders. We took a look at permissions on mailboxes in Azure Active Directory, and also multiple supported applications like Office 365, Teams, Yammer, etc. And we were able to basically discover the permissions our users have, right? The next important step is to have a strategy in place to administer Azure and Active Directory from a single console or from a single screen, something that's absent using the native tools, right? Here are a few examples. Let's say you have to onboard users in Active Directory and in Azure Active Directory. How would you do that? So typically as an admin, let's say you receive a request to onboard 20 users in a day, you have to go back into your Active Directory console. You'll have to say, create a new user. This is where you onboard users and you repeat the process for the 20 users. And then you'll have to head back into Azure Active Directory, and then you'll have to basically create a new user right here. Right? So if you head into Azure and all the way into Azure Active Directory, click on users, and you have to create a new user, give the user the required permissions right here. So this is a manual process. This is time taking. And as admins, we do not have that kind of time, right? We have to switch between windows. We have to onboard users in Azure, in Office 365 or any other supported application. But AD360 can help you smoothen that process for you because AD360 can basically automate the entire process, right? So let me show you a simple example right here. You can just give a list of usernames, right? Import them into AD Manager Plus, and you can execute a command that creates user accounts with an Active Directory, with an Office 365, on-premises Exchange if you have an on-premises Exchange server, and also Google Suite if you have cloud applications like Google Suite, right? So this is hybrid user onboarding from a single console without having to jump between various windows or various screens, or without having to go through the pain of scripting, right? So if I head into my AD Manager Plus console, automation, and if I head into create new automation, you can simply say create users, and you can specify a location of the CSV with the usernames, and all your users will be created, right? The automation uses something called a template. Now, to give you some insight, a template is something that will help you predefine user properties. So if I head into templates, if I head into, let's say, hybrid user creation right here, right? This is what I use to create hybrid users in my environment. So these are all my hybrid users, Active Directory properties. If I head into account, you can specify the user's account properties such as the profile path of your user, the home path, your account expiry date, the password flags that you wish to enable for the user. And this is not just limited to Active Directory, but also this can be used for Office 365 as well, right? So here's how it's going to work. If I head into Office 365, I can basically create the user in Office 365, give him or her a group membership, and I can set a few more values as well, right? So using the templates, I can take the template, place it in an automation, and automate the entire user creation process with an Active Directory and Azure or Office 365. And of course, I can notify admins as well, right? So whenever an automation is run, an admin will be notified via email and via SMS. So no automation will be run without an admin's or your consent. All right. So there are many more things you could automate. For example, your role-based delegation in Azure and in Active Directory. Now, like I said, you use something called the delegation of control wizard in Active Directory to basically delegate permissions to your users in Active Directory. You've got something called the Azure role-based access control to basically give users certain administrative permissions, right? But the problem with these is that they do not have time-based access. For example, when you delegate a permission for a user, you cannot delegate that permission for a set amount of time. These delegations cannot be made to go through multiple people. For example, if a help desk delegates a user permissions to reset passwords or create or modify other user accounts, this has to go through multiple people just to double check the activity. But this does not happen within Active Directory or within Azure, right? There is no multi-factor authentication whenever roles are delegated to end users, and a rogue user can simply delegate privileges to any other user, right? And the only way, the major problem that comes in is finding out which user has delegated permissions. So let's say I use the delegation control wizard, right? And I say delegate control and I give my user permissions, and I have to find out what permissions my user has been granted. The only way I can do this is by right-clicking on it, heading on properties, selecting the security tab, and checking if a user has been delegated permissions, right? This is when AD360 simplifies things for you, because AD360, if I head into the delegation tab, if I head into help desk roles, I can create a new role. Let's say I want to create a role for my HR manager, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to say HR manager role, and I want my HR manager to create users and to add them to certain groups, and also manage users in Office 365 as well, right? I can just say create user accounts for Office 365, and let's say add or remove users from or to certain groups, right? So this is AD management. This is Office 365 management. You can simply create a role. You can give the role to a technician. A technician is no one but an Active Directory user. So once you delegate the role to the technician can log into the console and perform the delegated operations, right? So the technician will only be able to see the permissions that he's delegated and no other tab within the tool, right? You've got something called help desk reports and technician report right here that will basically help you to maintain a checklist of permissions that your end users have been delegated, right? This is something you cannot do using the native tools, because the only way to do it is by right-click, select properties, and checking the security tab all over again, right? You've got something called the audit report that will basically help you audit the operations your technicians perform. Now you could delegate certain privileges in Active Directory in Office 365, all from a single console using the help desk roles and the delegation tab right here. There's a lot more that you can do. For example, you can clean up stale user accounts across Office 365. For example, if you have an inactive user account, you can delete the user across AD. You could revoke the user's license across Office 365 or Azure, and the end result would be a fully purged, clean user, right? And just another point that I forgot to mention was when it comes to delegation, all the delegations that you do within the tool do not involve native permission modifications, right? So the security tab, the permission modification does not happen. Everything happens within the tool alone. So your users' native AD permissions or native Office 365 permissions are left untouched. So this process is also called as non-invasive delegation and is extremely secure compared to native delegation methods because it doesn't involve manipulating a user's native permissions. Right? You could also automate certain tasks based on certain conditions. For example, this is a block user's activity within Office 365. When user account is blocked, you can set an automation to set a litigation hold to the user's mailbox, and then you could remove the user's license. Right? You could create a sequence of automations. It's up to you. It's up to your requirement. It's up to your need. You can create a sequence of automations. You could create a single automation. The list simply goes on. Right? So if I head into Office 365 Manager Plus, we've got an automation tab here. that will basically help you execute automations across Office 365. Right? So yes, AD Manager Plus can be used to execute automations across Active Directory and Office 365. But if you like to execute in-depth Office 365 automations, then Office 365 Manager Plus can help you for that, right? If I head into create new automation, all you got to do is simply select a particular task, right? For example, you could unblock blocked users. You could hide or unhide users' mailboxes from address lists. You could set or remove mailbox litigation hold. So sorry, all you got to do is check the box, hit add, specify a time for the automation to run, and you are good to go, right? This is an automation for license modification. You could assign licenses, you could remove licenses to users automatically based on their lifespan in your organization, right? Another really important feature that I wanted to speak about is time-based delegation. So if I head into workflow, right? If I head into create request, and you see something called set folder permissions, using AD 360, you can set permissions on certain objects based on a specific time, right? Now, let's say I want my user to have permissions on a folder just for 30 minutes. So after 30 minutes, the permission will automatically be revoked. If I head back into workflow, you see that this particular request, once raised, will go through multiple people, will go through multiple authorized users, and only when they approve it will the request be executed, something that cannot be done using native delegation. Right? So if a user, let's say, is added to a privileged group with an Active Directory, you can let that process go through multiple people, and not just that, you can time the process. So if a user needs temporary privileges, you can set that, and after the time, the privilege will automatically expire. Right? And of course, you can make this process go through multiple people as well. So there's a lot we looked into. If I head into reports, all these reports right here will help you understand what's happening, help you to discover permissions. And if I head into management, you can also bulk manage certain activities. For example, reports, Ntfs reports will help you understand permissions on your files and folders, right? If I head back into management, you see something called file server management right here. And if I click on modify Ntfs permissions, it will help you modify file or folder permissions across files and folders across your Windows file servers. Right? So you could select multiple folders, you could set the permissions, and the beauty of AD 360 is that there's always something extra. For example, this checkbox will remove existing permissions on a set of folders or a particular folder and apply the permissions that you've specified here. If you already have a folder with secure permissions applied, you can simply copy those permissions and let it apply right here. All right. So 3 important things: reports to help you understand what's happening across your Active Directory console, management for you to perform certain management tasks in Active Directory. For example, if you wish to reset passwords for bulk users, you could do that right here, right? Let's say you wish to unlock locked out user accounts. Here you have that option. Let's say you wish to modify group memberships for users in bulk. You can do that. So this is an ability to target individual attribute values and change them for bulk users. AD Manager Plus has these features for Active Directory. Office 365 Manager Plus has these features for Azure, for other Azure connected applications. And of course, you can manage certain activities as well using Office 365 Manager. So the concept of reporting and in-depth management applies to both Azure Active Directory and Active Directory. It's just 2 different tools, right? You can delegate permissions, of course, you can automate certain activities. Same logic applies to Office 365 as well. All right. Now, another important thing we need to discuss is authentication. Authentication is crucial when it comes to infrastructure security. And when I say authentication, the first thing that springs to mind is your password policy. Now, I'm pretty sure you would have noticed this. This is your Active Directory's password policy, been around from Windows Server 2000, hasn't undergone a single change, right? Now, we often blame our end users for passwords, but the thing I would like to put forth here is the users are not responsible for weak passwords. It's the policies that are responsible for weak passwords, right? So it's important that we strengthen our policies across Active Directory and across Azure Active Directory as well, right? Because Azure Active Directory, again, has its own set of password rules that it has to adhere to. So what's the solution here? Because Active Directory has a separate password policy, Azure has a separate password policy. If you have another application that is not a part of Azure, it will have its own password policy. So how do we fix this issue, right? And how weak are these password policies? Let me show you a simple example right here. If I head on to my VM, and if I minimize this, if I clear this up, you find a script here called the domain password spray, right? So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to import the script. This is just a simple password attack on Active Directory. The same could be done in Azure as well. I'm going to invoke domain password spray. And I'm going to give it a password whose value is going to be password at 123. And once I hit OK, you can see that I will be asked for a confirmation. And once I confirm, yes, you can see that here are a bunch of users and their plain text passwords, right? Password at 123, a very predictable password, but still widely used within organizations. And the problem with this is not users. The problem with this is Active Directory's password policy that lets your users get away with weak passwords, right? For this, I propose a solution, and that is a uniform password policy. So if I head into my browser here, if I open up my console, this is my AD Self-Service Plus console, the password security and the password management module of AD 360. If I head into configuration, I can configure a policy right here. Now, policies can be applied based on OUs, based on groups, based on individual users in Active Directory. Again, this is something you can't do using native Active Directory's password policy, right? You cannot apply the native Active Directory's password policy based on groups or individual users. You can only apply it based on your domain node. All right, so let me just show that to you. In fact, this is my account. And if I head into security settings, account policies, you see the password policy right here. This can only be applied to the default domain. It cannot be applied to your individual users or individual groups in Active Directory, right? But this is something AD Self-Service Plus can beat, because AD Self-Service Plus can apply policies based on OUs, groups, and individual users. And if I head into Password Policy Enforcer, this is the place where you can enforce a custom password policy for your organization. Right? So this will work in cohesion together with your Active Directory's password policy. Now you could restrict repetition of certain characters. You could restrict certain patterns, like your pattern that we just performed an attack on, like password at 123, right? You can ban the use of certain dictionary words. You can set a minimum and a maximum length as well. Right? And we've got something else called multi-factor authentication that will help you enforce two-factor authentication for your Active Directory logons. Right? So how would this work? How would this process work? Let me show you a simple example right here. So when a user logs on to his or her domain join system, he or she enters the password. This password is governed by the custom password policy that we've enforced. So this password has to be strong, right? And once the user enters the password, for added security, a multi-factor authentication process kicks in, and only when the user approves the multi-factor authentication check will he or she be allowed to log on to the Active Directory domain, right? But wait, we are talking about Azure as well. We're talking about other cloud applications as well. How do we enforce the password policy across all logons, not just Active Directory, but also across Azure, across Office 365, across any other third-party cloud application that you may use in your organization, right? In order to do that, we've got a feature called application right here. And do you see something called single sign-on, right? I'm pretty sure you understood what I'm trying to say here. When you apply single sign-on, let's say to Office 365, or let's say to Google Suite, let's say to any other cloud application that you may use, right? This is how it's going to work. A user will basically log on to his or her domain, right? Now the logon process is done with the password, with the multi-factor authentication, and the user is trying to access his or her cloud application, right? In this case, Office 365. And when the user accesses the application, you can see that the user does not have to enter a password another time, right? Because with single sign-on implemented, the user's authentication was already done at the Active Directory logon, right? The user can directly access the cloud application like Office 365 or any other application that you may have configured. So what do I mean by this? What does this mean for you in terms of password security? Your user logs on to your domain joined system, enters the password, that's step one, goes through multi-factor authentication, that's step two, and that's all your user needs to do, because with single sign-on implemented, the user will have seamless access to multiple cloud-based applications, right? And if you have a custom application that doesn't come under this list, you can basically set up that custom application here as well, right? Just ensure that the application is SAML or SAML supported. All right. We also offer something called a weak password reporter tool, as you can see on the screen right here, that will basically help you to determine all your on-premise users and if they have weak passwords. Where does this tool take the passwords from? It has about 1 lakh of inbuilt passwords. Now you can add in your own password list. You can add in your own set of passwords to this list as well. And when you run it using the tool, it will basically detect all your on-premise users and their passwords if the passwords are weak, right? Let me know if you need the tool. Just shoot me a message on the chat box and I'll be sure to share the link with you. This is a free tool that we are giving away for your password security. All right. Last but not the least is to enforce security. Now, it's good that we were able to discover what permissions our users have by looking into attribute values, by looking into file or folder permissions, by looking into security permissions in objects. We were able to find out what permissions our users have across Azure, license information, group-based information, other application information, such as Office 365 or Microsoft Teams or Yammer. We were able to understand what admin roles our users have and all the deal, right? Second step, we were able to set up certain management processes, right? And that we did with the help of automation. So with the help of automation, we were able to automate certain critical tasks within Azure and within Office 365. With the help of reports, we were able to gain the insights. And with the help of the management tab, we were able to basically target special operations and apply them to bulk users, right? Permission changes on bulk users in a nutshell, right? The last step is to enforce security. Basically, audit events that are happening in Azure and in Active Directory, right? But in Active Directory, events are recorded across your domain controllers, across your workstations, across your member servers. Each device, each endpoint records events, and all of these events must be tracked to detect sensitive activities, right? When it comes to Azure, you've got something called the Azure Active Directory logs. So if I head back into Azure Active Directory, and you will see something called Audit Logs right here that will basically help you to determine permissions your users have right here. And not just this, you've also got another option for Azure, that's the Office 365 Protection and Compliance Center, right? So using that, you can basically search for certain Azure Active Directory or Office 365 related operations, right? Now, I'm not going to complicate this further. Let me give you a simple use case, a simple example right here, right? But the important thing for you to understand is that every device records events, and all of these events have to be scanned for malicious activities. And when it comes to Azure, there are audit logs in Azure, there are sign-in logs in Azure, separately recorded, and all of these logs, including logs for other Office 365 applications, will be sent to a unified audit log, which can be accessed from the Office 365 Security and Compliance Center. Okay, now let me give you a really small example right here. Let's say your organization is subject to a brute force attack, right? And an attacker has gained access and is trying to get hold of your sensitive data. How would you stop this from happening? Here's a simple example, right? So if I head into Active Directory, if I open up my event viewer, these are all the security logs, all file or folder based changes, logon events, group membership changes, user attribute changes, any security object attribute changes are all recorded, right? Let's say I want to monitor log on events with event ID 4624. So I right click on this, I click on filter current log, and I try and monitor the event, which is 4624. And once I hit OK, look at the number of log on events on my domain controller. There are more than 15,000 events, right? And only I have access to this machine, nobody else. Now, how would I find out a brute force logon attempt from here? Here's another example. Let's say an end user is granted a privileged role within Azure Active Directory, an admin role within Azure Active Directory. How would I track that? I'll have to head into Azure Active Directory, head into the console, and under service, you've got something called the core directory service right here. Here we go. Under category, I'm going to select something called role management, right? So these are admin roles granted to my end users in Azure Active Directory. The user could be a password administrator. The user could be in charge of creating other user accounts. The user could be in charge of managing applications in Azure Active Directory, or it could even be a device administrator, right? Look at the number of events right here. And what is the name of the user who's been granted this role? We do not know. What is the name of the role that was granted to which user? We do not know, right? The only way we could determine that is to click on each event. This tab gives you nothing. If I head into modified properties, and this is where I see that the Exchange Service Administrator has been granted to this particular target user, right? This is the name of the user account. Right? So that's the problem. The logs are present, yes, but then the logs do not give you a bird's eye view of changes that have occurred, right? Now, let's say I want to find out which of my user has been given permissions to manage passwords, basically a password administrator in Azure Active Directory. There's no way I could search for those permissions. I'll have to click on each audited event. I'll have to head into modified properties and see what's happening, right? And if you can recollect, I spoke about something called the Unified Audit Log in Office 365 Security and Compliance Center. And I can search for certain activities here. For example, I can say role added member to role, right? And once I hit search, the result will be in front of me. And the result is still very unclear. So if I click on a particular event, and if I click on more information, you can see that this is the name of the user, and this is the information all in JSON data. Right? So I basically have to go through all of this JSON data and find out if my user has been granted a role within Azure Active Directory. The same problem applies to group management activities. For example, when users are added to groups or removed from groups. The same problem applies when users are granted, when applications are granted administrative consent within Azure Active Directory. Right? So this is when the AD Audit Plus module of AD 360 simplifies things for you. So as you can see, this is my AD Audit Plus console, and the AD Audit Plus console basically gives you a bird's eye view on all activities happening on your Azure and your Active Directory console. Here are the top logon failures on my domain, and all of them happen to be an administrator. So this is a cause for an alarm, right? If I head into reports, you can find multiple reports right here pertaining to Active Directory, pertaining to Azure Active Directory. For example, the logon failures report will basically help me find out which user has failed a logon on which server. It could be a DC, and what is the logon failure time, right? If I scroll further down, you find many operations. For example, if a user's password has been reset, or if a user's password has been changed, or a password never expires flag has been enabled for a user account, right? Or simply if a group policy setting has been changed, right? For example, if an end user is, let's say, granted the permission to allow to log on remotely on a domain controller. Let's say an end user is granted permission to take ownership of files and other objects. Group policy changes such as this, setting changes such as this must be brought to notice, and these reports will help you do that. Right? Not just your object attribute changes, but also your permission. So if I head into permission changes, you can find out explicit security permission changes on all your objects. So if I head into domain level permission changes, these are permission changes on my domain node, basically. So this is my domain node, right? So any permission change on my domain node will be brought to notice right here, because these permissions can be used for malicious purposes. For example, if I scroll down, you'll find something called right domain password and lockout policy. Any user with this privilege will be able to modify the domain password and lockout policy, right? And here is a permission that has been granted to a user. The permission's name is replicating directory changes. If a user has been granted this permission, the user could basically pretend to be a domain controller and request password hashes of any other user from other domain controllers in the organization, right? So these reports that you see right here for Active Directory will help you monitor your Active Directory infrastructure. So if a logon is failed, if a user is added to a group, if a user's password is reset, or if a user is given a permission that he or she is not supposed to have, changes such as this will immediately be captured in real time and produced in the form of a report, right? If I head into Azure Active Directory, there's a lot more that you can do with respect to Azure Active Directory. For example, the role, if a user is added to a role, all of this information is right here. And of course, you can search for particular role names and see if a user has been granted that role, right? Something you cannot do using the native tools. If I head into group management, this will help you monitor Azure AD group memberships real time. If I head into device management, you can find out if a user is being added to a device, or if an owner is being added to a device, if a license has been assigned to an end user. And if I further head down into application management, do you see this option called recently consent to application? This is the newest attack technique that attackers are using. They're basically creating an application in Azure, giving it admin consent for backdoor access into Azure Active Directory. So this way, they never have to compromise the user account. They can simply create a backdoor application and give it administrative consent, right? So all of these changes that you see can be viewed in the form of reports. They are searchable. You can go back in time and look for changes. You can search for changes across multiple Azure Active Directory tenants or multiple Active Directory domains as well, right? And I've got something called configuration right here, and you can configure alerts for such activities. So if I hit search, and let's say I type in admin right here, right? So this report, this alert will basically alert me if an admin user has a logon failure in the domain, right? If the admin user is a member of any of these groups, then the user happens to be a privileged or an admin user, and you can alert the admin or an authorized user via email, via SMS, right? You can also set threshold-based alerts. For example, if there are more than 10 logon failures occurring in a minute and has the same username, basically performed by the same actor, you can throw an alert. If there are logon failures happening outside of business hours, or if there are file or folder activities happening outside of business hours, you can detect those changes right here, and you can inform the admin via email and via SMS, right? And under the file audit tab, you've got something called all of your storage devices, basically your Windows file servers, clusters, NetApp, EMC. So any file or folder that's deleted, created, moved, changed, any ownership change on a file or folder, any permission change on a file or folder will be brought to notice right here using these reports across your data storage devices, right? We've also got certain advanced reports across your workstations. For example, if I scroll down, you will see something called Powershell Auditing right here. So if a user is running malicious scripts like the password spray script or the script to add a backdoor user to an admin group, this report will catch the user and the script he is trying to run. Here we have this Ross trying to run the PowerUp script. And of course, you can read into the data of the script, or you can set alerts as well, right? So there are a lot of reports here for your Active Directory, for Azure, for your file, for your data storage devices, and across your workstations, your workgroup machines, your member servers as well, right? And AD 360 can help you monitor all of these changes and alert on them. The difference between these and the reports that we saw earlier was that the earlier reports are on-demand reports. So if you want information, you can generate the report, right? But these reports, the reports that we saw within the AD Audit Plus console, are change monitoring reports. So every time there's a security change, like an attribute being changed or a permission being changed across your hybrid Active Directory infrastructure, that's across Active Directory and Azure, these reports will immediately record those activities and alert you as an admin as a help desk technician, right? One last thing that I wanted to talk about is that every alert that we see right here, for example, let's say admin groups have been modified privileges, right? So a backdoor user is added to an admin group. So you can set up mitigation actions as well. So if a backdoor user is added to an admin group, you can immediately set up a script right here to terminate the attacker's session, to shut down the attacker's system, or to disable the user account. So this is like a mitigation activity to an alert. So just in case you're away, the custom script you configured right here will conduct the counter action or the mitigation action for you. All right. So yes, we've looked into authentication with passwords. We've looked into authorization by reading into each and every privilege, each and every attribute value that our objects have within AD, within Azure. We set up certain processes, we set up automation, we set up delegations, we set up more visibility into objects, and finally, we set up monitoring, right? Monitoring for security changes on our domain. So authentication, authorization, and monitoring, these are the three standing pillars for an identity and access management solution, right? So AD360 can help you with that. And the important thing to keep in mind is that all of these processes happened whilst keeping user convenience in mind. Everything happens from a single console. There's no need for you to jump from one console to another. So let's say your requirement is to manage Active Directory and your passwords, right? Just Active Directory and passwords and not Azure. You can select these two modules and you can access them from within AD360, right? So AD360 is a single console with different modules that we discussed today. So all you got to do is select the modules that you want, and you can access all of them from this single console without having to jump between multiple windows. That's something we strive to avoid here at ManageEngine. All right. Now, before I end today's session, I would like to thank you all for your time.